Well, good evening. My name is Julie Riccardi, and I hope that you can hear me. I have the honor of being on the board for the Raleigh Ringers. And before all of you were able to get on the Zoom, it was fun to talk about my earliest exposure to the Raleigh Ringers out in Las Vegas many moons ago, and I never dreamt I'd live in Raleigh, nor did I dream I'd be on the board of the Raleigh Ringers. So it's exciting for us to host this evening. And it's also wonderful to see so many people on this call. As we begin tonight, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat where you are hailing from and who you are connected to, we would love to see that. I did see the name Lynn Bogovich, and I worked with an Alan Bogovich at Purdue University. I don't know if there's any connection, but you don't see the last name Bogovich very often. So I thought I'd do a little shout out, but we're thrilled to see all of you tonight. And this evening we have the great privilege of hearing about the history of handbells with Debbie Rice and Bob Avant. So with no further ado, I will welcome Bob and Debbie to the floor to tell us all about the history of handbells.
Oh, wow. All about the history.
Or most of it.
We'll have to be here a very long time if we do that. Hey, first, thank you for the invitation to be one of the presenters here. And it's just a thrill to be on the same docket with Debbie. I've enjoyed following her from afar for many years, and it's just very fun to be on the same docket. So she and I are going to tag team a bit as we go through. I'm going to start from the early times and take it up through roughly Margaret Shercliffe, and Debbie will fill in some gaps and then take it from Margaret forward. So that's kind of the general plan. I guess if there are questions, just put them in the chat. I'm not going to read the chat as we're going because I'm kind of busy talking. But I'm sure if some point there's some questions, somebody can break in and ask those questions. Be glad to answer anything we can. So I'm going to jump in with a history of handbells and say that the earliest sound producing objects or instruments have basically the same kind of characteristics as handbells do today, in that something hits something else to make a sound. So with that idea, I'll just take us all the way back to primitive man, where they likely discovered that certain kinds of rocks were somewhat resonant, and if they hit them with something or whatever. And so, that was kind of a first idea, a concept of that kind of thing, perhaps. And maybe they found ways to, I don't know, suspend them. Maybe they just stacked them up, did something. But they, at some point, music was discovered out of making sounds from natural things. Other things that were also natural were things like they found like rattles that were made of gourds, natural, with natural seeds on the insides, or some other sound producing kinds of things that were made from natural materials. Ancient man, so a little bit more progressive there, found ways to fashion wood into a resonant object. And there are still examples of that running around today or through a lot of history, where things like a tree would be hollowed out. Coconut shells would be fashioned into something that, again, something could be struck and make sounds with as it went through. Bamboo tubes could be, hollowed out, cut, and be able to make sounds. So all the way through this early time, humans were involved in making sounds happen from things around them, things of that nature. And then skipping ahead a few years with the discovery of metal. The earliest creations for sound things made with metal were done so to try to mimic what had been produced from natural materials. They made shakers out of metal, metal plates, I guess, to substitute for rocks, something that they could do that, and more hollow shapes similar to the shapes of hollowed out trees or whatever. But again, they're just kind of figuring out what makes sound, and you know, they can strike something and make a sound out of it. So skipping ahead a little bit more to the origins of bells themselves, um, and while the concept of creating a resonant sound in some way was kind of global, and it just popped up and all over the world in different cultures and in different ways. It is China where we have the oldest references to objects, at least ones that have survived through time, which we can see as showing kind of the roots of bells in those things. And some of these references to bells go back like 4,600 years or longer. And if you have references at 4,600 years ago, you had something existing much earlier than that even. So there's some sort of this thing strikes that thing to make a sound, and they would resemble a bell in some way, shape, or form. In the Middle East, Italy, and Greece, roughly a little more than 2,000 years ago, so still in BC times, there are examples of fairly recognizable metal bells that are found. Again, meaning that, well, if they are referenced or found in that time frame, they probably existed even much earlier. But still, that's kind of a concrete set of dates for things that we would call bells. If they're made out of metal, they were not the shape of like handbells at all. They were more likely looking like a cowbell, in that it was originally a sheet of metal that was then folded over on itself and in some way affixed, stapled together, or you know, fashioned together by the blacksmith or whatever. And so that's kind of what bells looked like in those time frames. The uses were, well, utilitarian, in that they were around the necks of animals such as horses and sheep. So you can keep track of your flock as they go out there. The Bible also has a lot of references to the presence and use of bells. So you know, this concept of bells was fairly well known and fairly well deployed in lots of different ways, shapes, and forms several thousand years ago. Yeah, other countries and continents also had their own versions of different kinds of sounding kinds of things that made sounds. Bells of various shapes, sizes, and construction. Some metal, some not metal, but and they were generally used for ceremonial, religious, or utilitarian type of reasons. And more uses in this time frame, 2,000 plus years ago, started to percolate up. That would be to call people together. A purpose for the bell was to call people together or to communicate out some things that may be happening. So skipping it now to the first couple of hundred years or so, few hundred years, AD. And so now we're going to really start seeing the roots of bells, and especially as they are connected into the church. There are more and more examples during that time. This is several hundred years from zero forward, where handheld kinds of bells are being used to announce the time of worship gatherings. And some other ceremonial things as well. And again, these are not cast bells yet. They are still fashioned out of some material. If they're metal, they're folded over sheets of metal, etc. And this use that became a common thing to call people together to worship was something that extended to such that there was a traveling ringer that would go through the streets ringing a bell, and that was the indication of time to leave the home and come to worship together. So that's an important concept. And we'll get after it now. In roughly 400 AD, there was a bishop in the area of Campania, Italy, in the city of Nola, named Paulinus. And in 400 AD, he is credited at least with this, that he had the bright idea of doing away with that problem of sending somebody out into the streets, and instead he decided to fashion a large kettle-shaped kind of bell, mostly out of copper, is what I understood from the research, and put it on top of the church roof. Not quite a tower yet, but on the roof. And then when that rang out, it was a way to call the people to worship, at least initially. And the city of Nola, that's not New Orleans, Louisiana, by the way. That word Nola comes back and is shown as one of the types of bells that was described that was to be used was called a Nola. So things like that were connecting. Also, this is also the root of campanology or campanologist, the study of or the ringing of bells. It roots all the way back to that area in Italy. So that's where we began as handbell ringers, was from that part of the world. And about fast forward a couple of hundred years, now early 600s, the Pope looked around and saw that, well, that communicating thing with the bell and the probably in the tower at this point was a good thing, and it was helpful to call people together. And so the Pope encouraged or decreed that that bells should be put into towers to help bring the parishioners together to worship. And that's in 600. I think it's technically 604 AD, if you want to know what that one is. So it was in this time that the practice of this type of use of a bell was really starting to spread from Italy northward through the rest of Europe, and it settled quite a bit into England, on up to Ireland and in the other European countries. But for whatever reason, England really latched onto this concept. There was a reference, and currently up to this point still, it's just one bell of some type, one particular shape. It probably does not resemble what we see today, but it was something that was large, metal, and was struck to make sound. And that was what it was looking like. There was a reference in the 8th century, so it's now in the 700s, of multiple bells starting to appear in England. And multiple means more than one, probably initially less than 4, maybe as many as 8, but no more than that. And that was in English belfries. And it had to have been considered at that time that was for communication purposes initially. There's a fire in the city. That's this sounding pitch or this pattern of ringing. There's a marriage coming up. There's a funeral coming up. Whatever, come to worship. All these utilitarian and communication types of things. That was the purpose. And so multiple bells helped communicate out. So that was what was kind of going on. And again, this is 8th century or so. And that trend would continue moving forward. More bells, more communication, more this kind of thing going on in the church. So I'll kind of skip ahead just a little bit in my notes here, but the earliest foundries, those that made the bells, were the home churches themselves, where the bell was intended to ring. So this is kind of all homemade. There wasn't the Whitechapel yet, almost, but not quite. So they were just making their own and putting it up in their own churches. There is in York Cathedral in London, there is a stained glass set of windows that was installed in 1330 that depicted a recognizable process to cast bells. So this is a major leap forward in design and putting things together in a more organized way, perhaps. So, from 1330 forward, it looks a lot like what it is today. But before that, so what we have to infer is that that process of casting bells in a way that we see like today with same shape and same kind of concepts, that was developed between like 1000 and 1330. And I don't have much information in between those dates as to how that occurred and who did the experimenting and did that, but that's the time frame that quite a bit of development took place. And apparently by 1300, they were pretty well set in how to do this and to make these things happen, the bells happen, and even to a point to start to tune them to a little bit, at least make them less thuddy and more resonant. They were after that. Also during this time, again, I'll say post 1000 AD, in the church, the bells were revered, and in fact, they were so revered that they themselves, the bells themselves, were the beneficiary of ceremonies to baptize them, better stated, consecrate them for use with the church. And that was a ceremony that actually still happens today a lot, but it really took on its own life at that point in time. So the resulting condition of the bell after it was consecrated was said to hold great powers. And I want to read a brief quote from a book called Bells by Coleman from 1928, because it says a lot here. It says, the service of baptism was held in order that the bells might have power to act as preservatives against thunder and lightning and hail and wind and storms of every kind, and that they may drive away evil spirits. Which leads me to the Department of Evil Spirits that's coming. Driving away evil spirits was a common belief of the power of bells. And again, in this time frame, superstition and religion were almost interchangeable at times. There was not much of a dividing line between them. They just kind of wove in and out of themselves. Some superstitions became religions, some religious things became superstitions, etc. But that concept of driving away evil spirits was a common belief of the power of bells. And some people in this time frame began to carry a small bell with them as they went about their way through the town, so that they could occasionally ring the bell while they're walking to wherever they're going to chase away the evil spirits that might possibly be following them. And a tradition became became a tradition about that concept that outside of a person's home, they mounted a bell so that when a guest would arrive, that guest could ring that bell and chase away the evil spirits before they entered the house. And you might guess what this is leading to, in that this is a connection to today's current concept of ringing a doorbell as guests come for a visit. Today's purpose is utilitarian in that its use is to announce somebody's arrival at someone's door, but it has its roots in the superstition / religious purpose of chasing away evil spirits. So doorbells, there you go. It means something in our neck of the woods. I found that fascinating. There was utilitarian uses in churches of bells, and these things were tied to daily things, such as the hours of the day, A curfew bell was to be rung to tell everybody to turn all the lights off, candles, and shut down for the night. And that's it for the activities. Everybody goes to sleep. There was a real thing of that. There was also all these different occasions, marriages, funerals, and bells were just used for everything in anything. And the concept of the dinner bell has its origin here. A clock chiming on the hour has its roots here. The death knell is also rooted here. It was believed that a consecrated bell being rung as a person was dying or just had died kept the evil spirits at bay and allowed the soul to pass peacefully. So these things that are in our lexicon, they actually have roots back in this time frame, 1000 to, I'll say, 1400 or so at this point. And this is now starting to lead us towards change ringing as a concept. Once the ability to tune the bells was accomplished and multiple bells were being placed in church towers, again, multiple bells translates to maybe as many as 8 if they were incredibly wealthy, but probably no more than that. The people soon determined that there was more to do with bells than just ring out messages to the town. And so the early tower bell ringing of multiple bells was done so for fun, for entertainment initially, and they would ring their set of bells in the sequence from high to low. If they had 3 bells, it was 3 2 1 3 2 1 3 2 1 3 forever and ever. 4 bells, same concept. 5 6 7, all the same concepts. Whatever that was, and that was a fun activity, and ultimately, probably soon, grew pretty old with both the ringers and the citizens, and that led to creativity coming in with the application of changing those patterns of ringing to of the available number of bells on each successive pass. So instead of 3 2 1 3 2 1, it may have gone 3 2 1 3 1 2 1. I can't do it anymore, but there you go. So this idea of changing the bells in these patterns for fun, for entertainment, and to show off a bit to your neighbors, that became a thing. And we're talking about 1400, maybe a little bit earlier, but 1400 and forward with that idea. And change ringing, I mean, there's a ton about change ringing, and I'm not going to speak to any of the ins and outs of it, but I'll just say it's a thing. And it was something that took on a very strong life of its own and really had its heyday in the 1600s and into the 1700s, uh, uh, such that particularly in England, uh, and this had become quite a source of pride, both locally. Whoever the parishioners were, they're very proud of themselves and their ringing abilities, as well as a nation. The country of England was nicknamed the Ringing Isle, ISLE, because there are so many groups that did this kind of activity, and it was very, very prideful, which is an important concept. And during this time, the 1600s and into the 1700s in particular, there was a proliferation of ringing clubs and societies, and the desire to excel at the ringing of more complex patterns than the other nearby tower bell ringers. So competition, people are proud of this. Competition is popping up. So out of that activity and out of those feelings arose a natural desire to, by these small groups, to get better by practicing. And if they practiced on the Tower of Bells, you can imagine what that might sound like when the patterns are not mastered yet, and so it gets cacophony out there on the with the Tower Bells, the community. The cows stop giving milk, people are trying to sleep, whatever. So that condition really was not tenable, but they still wanted to practice, and this is where the need caused the rise of what we have today, the invention of the handbell that we utilize today. While there had been handbells in existence, the way that they were sounded was either by an external, like a drumstick, I'll use that, but some kind of an external striker. But more often, it was an internal clapper that was freely ringing, swinging inside the bell in any direction. And because of that, it could not be used for practicing because the timing was intermittent with all this clanging in different directions. So it really wasn't a good tool. So desire to get better, practice, desire to practice indoors, use handbells, desire to make the handbell usable for timing purposes, new clapper assembly. And so in 1700, right on the dot, 1700, the Cors brothers, that's C-O-R-S, in England, developed a new mechanism that restricted that freely flowing clapper head. It restricted it to a front and back only direction. And the illustrations I've seen of their invention is very similar to what we have today. More similar to Whitechapel design than others of today, but the concept is the same. Restricted clapper direction in one direction only, and so that allowed the control ability of making ringing sounds such that they could practice timing, and the timing would be to practice their change ringing patterns in a way that was much more comfortable for them and much less um, uh, um, bad for them as they tried to practice outdoors, as it were, with the real tower bells. So, um, and that again is 1700. And this is important because they moved indoors, and the places they could go when they went indoors generally was limited to the local pub. And there's quite a lot of references to ringers enjoying themselves at the pub, sometimes after, but sometimes before they do these ringing sessions to practice. And so it probably was not very long after they started doing that kind of activity, practicing their change ringing with handbells, that and then the pub, that they decided to, well, let's see if we can play a tune, because we hear singing in the pub next to us or below us or wherever they were. And so this started the rise of tune ringing, which again leads to what we have today. So, so this was 1700 plus a few years was the split that we see today. The split being secular and sacred handbell ringing in this case, or bell ringing of any type. That which is still in the church and that which is popular music of the day, or other types of music that is performed. So that's really where we are rooted as well, with community groups in particular, but also with church groups. It's from that time. So from 1700 forward into the 1800s is a proliferation of tower bell ringing. with more bells being cast and again and added to towers, and in particular, more tune ringing. Again, this is all being led by England in particular, but also other European countries are following suit. I just had recently read another reference, a quote from some bishop. I think back in this era, early 1600s, that said that if all of the bells in England rang at the same time, there would be nary a spot in the country that someone would not hear a bell ringing. So that just speaks to how proliferated the use of handbells was throughout that country. It was the thing. It was a thing to do. So 1700s into the 1800s, things just got more complex as far as change ringing patterns, but also tune ringing became a thing, much like we have community groups today. And so there were, while generally it was the same group, a group of change ringers also got together and did a set on tune ringing, and they developed these things out. They even had competitions between these teams of ringers, and there were awards and medals given out, and this is in the early, now into the 1800s. And here we are in the 1800s, and I'll skip into America this time. While Europe and especially England were in the bell ringing heyday with a proliferation into most towns with ringing groups, ringing in America was very limited due to the small number of deployed tower bell installations. It just wasn't as much of a thing in America as it was in Europe. And not much is documented prior to 1838, which happens to be the date when there's information about a celebrated group of entertainers, the Peak family, uh, who entertained by many ways, singing or playing instruments, but they also were accomplished handbell ringers, and they originated in the Boston area. That group would stay together through 2 generations and through several splits in the family, but they would do so for about 50 years. And they were considered as a successful touring vaudeville style group throughout that time. So 50 years, starting in the like 1838, 1840, right in that range. But the strongest influence and exposure to handbell ringing in America early on came as a result of P.T. Barnum. Yeah, that guy. He brought over outstanding, an outstanding and contest-winning group from England, the Lancashire Ringers, to join his group of entertainers. And in his own style, he decided that they needed some spicing up. So they needed to be more exotic, and they would be if only they were called Swiss bell ringers. And so he called them Swiss bell ringers, although they're from England. And he even dressed them up in the part. When some of those ringers said to PT, well, but we don't speak the language that's in Switzerland. We're English. And PT told them, well, just speak like you normally do, and these Americans won't know any different. So I thought that was fun too. So that group, the Swiss bell ringers, it was really the Lancashire ringers from England. They took on a couple of tours with PT across America, starting in the mid 1800s. I think 1847 was one of the dates, and I think another 5 years later they did another swing through. So I'll pause and kind of do an aside comment that, again, that was very influential to Americans to see this group come through and play alongside of the other things that PT brought. the different kinds of strange things that one might see, a circus type of atmosphere. And I believe that that is the root also of handbells being labeled as a novelty. And I think that concept, we've had a hard time shaking that. I also remember seeing through an Overtones article in the mid 60s, there was even a group that was a church group that was dressed up in Swiss lederhosen kind of things, and they were ringing in America. And so, and the stigma of Swiss bell ringers and as a novelty, it's just something we've had a hard time shaking. But that's again where that was rooted. The Peak family ringers had a much longer run than the Swiss bell ringers um, with PT, and they did a lot more, many more tours, and did a lot more to evangelize the idea of handbells in America. I think their last tour or their last time together was like in 18, lost the date, 70, 65, 70, 75, somewhere in that time frame is when they uh, disbanded for the last time. Finishing out the 1800s, interest in handbells and many other things was blunted by the Civil War. And of course, the recovery time of following the Civil War, which takes you to late 1800s, which happens to be an economic downturn in America. So that made traveling groups less profitable and less likely to get out there. So, we were handbell ringing in America. It just had got off to a rough start, strange start. And then we had these issues with Civil War and economics that were going on. Enter the 1900s, early 1900s. There was, again, economic issues in America. So, people are not prepared to do things, um, something considered as extra that might be happening. And the vaudeville period, it was kind of changing a bit. Society was changing out from under it. And so it became a stagnant period for handbells relative to maybe what was before and certainly what was to come afterwards in these early years. World War I did a lot of blunting on its own with anything and everything. And globally, I can only imagine how many handbell sets were melted down for the cause of war to make bullets or bombs or whatever they could make. So World War I happened, and so less and less was deemed um, something to do because they were busy being in a war. Um, and that leads us up to about 1923 when things changed. And this is 1923 is where the root of the modern day renaissance of handbell ringing began. And that began in the living room of Margaret Shercliffe. And this is where I guess I'll stop and take any questions, and then we'll be passing it on to Debbie, who will take us from Margaret on to today.
So far, we haven't had any questions in the chat, but I do think you've covered a lot of ground. So you surprised me.
Well, it was surprising actually to have so much history available, and there's some extra things I've learned along this journey to prepare for today. But you get a real feel for where we have come from and how it relates to today, and that's really what I was trying to message, is that even back to prehistoric time, that's not true, primitive man times, there were things that we can see evolving forward to today and on like in the year 1000 and move forward. There are so many connections to today. It's just interesting.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Bob, I thought I read somewhere that the Peak family bought their first set of bells from the Lancashire, from P.T. Barnum. Is that correct?
They did.
They did, yeah. And it was when, okay, there was apparently some sort of problem with some of the people that PT had brought over. I don't know, maybe Debbie knows more about that. But yeah, they had to go home, as it were, after just a few tours with PT. And so the bells were left, I believe, in St. Louis.
St. Louis. Mhm.
And then and I guess the Peak family found out about that and worked to acquire that set and did so.
Yeah, that's the way it happened.
Awesome. Whew.
I've also found newspaper articles of other bell ringers in the 19th century in the vaudeville circuit and also in the Chautauqua circuit.
Yes.
So I think it existed in the vaudeville level.
Yeah, Spalding ringers were there, Berger family ringers were there, Story family ringers were there, all during that same period. And it was really the introduction of the radio and music recordings that started the demise of the handbells in vaudeville in the late 1890s.
Interesting. Was it the demise of vaudeville in general, or just?
It was the
Just bells?
start. Yeah, the new invention of radio was a huge demise in the downfall of vaudeville, or the lack of interest in vaudeville.
And vaudeville was, if you look it up, the definition, it's essentially a variety show. Yeah, and kind of unrelated things thrown together for entertainment value. And vaudeville period was really late 1800s forward into early 1900s. But the Peak ringers, what PT did, that was vaudevillian. I mean, it was just variety of this and that. So they were kind of ahead of their time. Debbie, go for it.
All right, I will try to blaze through this as quickly as I can, but I want you to get to know Margaret Homer before she was married, Nichols Shercliffe, a little bit, because she was such an interesting personality, and the way she evolved into this art it hasn't changed the way we are as new ringers that are starting out the first time. And so she just has a fun story. In 1899, she was 20 years old and asked her family if she could buy a turning lathe. And that was a result of her interest in developing the skills in carpentry. She had also become a very professionally well-known tennis player, but her family said no to the lathe. They didn't want that in the house. So she continued her studies at MIT in carpentry and woodworking and science. And she started her own business with other women who are also in carpentry. So while I'm telling you a little bit more about that, I sent a picture to Sarah with Margaret's business card of what she made, and also an early picture of her in her early years at age 20. So anytime you want to throw that up, I will keep moving ahead. But to know that her first stuff was not in bells, it was in carpentry and making wood products. She was part of the Old South Church in North Boston, which had one of the few sets of tower bells that Bob referred to. And whenever I hear his story, and thank you, Bob, for sharing so much, I can't help but reflect it. These bells and these tower bells, it was the internet of the day. If you knew something, you heard the church bells and you knew what was going on in the community. So we can claim some heritage there. But this particular set of bells at the Old North Church had this inscription: "We are the first ring of bells cast for the British Empire in North America." Okay, these bells were hung in 1744. Margaret's father was very much involved and very passionate about these bells that were hanging in the tower, and become aware that they were not ringing in tune very well. So in 1902, he announced, I'm skipping ahead on my notes here so we can catch up a little bit. He was discouraged by the limited opportunity for ringing practice in the tower. In 1902, he announced that he was going to London. He was going to take his daughter with her, because in London, this is a quote, "The more they ring, the better they like it." So Margaret said in her memoirs, "I did not at first relish this break from my anticipated summer of tennis and woodworking, but my father's enthusiasm for the trip and his complete faith that I was made of the stuff of ringing swept me along." So they boarded a ship. His father had all these bells with him. And she continues in her memoirs to say, Papa had brought his heavy set of handbells with him, and with selected passengers started a little bell ensemble in this voyage so that she could continue her change ringing skills on these heavy bells that he was taking over to London for renovation. So they arrive in London, and I'll just forget to mention, the mother of one of my former ringers was a Beacon Hill ringer and related to Margaret Shercliffe through marriage. So I have some chapters from Margaret's personal memoirs that she wrote for her family, and that's what I'm referring to in sharing this. So they reach London, they've got the bells. The first belfry we climbed was in the Tower of St. Matthew in the Whitechapel region, known for its crooks. Much out of breath after climbing the circular stairs, I'm introduced to the other ringers and the conductor. He asked me if I'd like to have a go and which bells I would prefer. I spoke for the third and then sat to work, raising the exact place to grasp the tuffing. And the bottom of that is actually her advertisement for the work that she did. And this is a picture of her at this time of which I am speaking. So ringing is an exercise. In contrast to the ringing bells at the church in Boston, these bells rang with perfect precision. Mine was the only one that was out of place. And for a while I kept my place, but my experience in change ringing was absolute zero. The bells rang in rapid succession, striking all 7 in one revolution. It was difficult to pick out the bell I should follow as my rope sight was poor. When I lost control of my bell, it rang sooner than intended, and the other ringers, this was child's play for them. But on my part, it took every bit of muscle I possessed. The ringers kept an eye on me and tried to help, but suddenly ringer number 5 let go. Oops, I lost my place. Da, 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 da. Oh, shucks. I'm sorry. Ringer number 5. Okay, he recklessly let go of the rope and beckoned to me. How was I know that this was his way of saying that we were supposed to be dodging? That would be helpful coaching, shouting at me in Cockney bell ringing vernacular, drowned it out by the noise of the bells, was completely unintelligible to me. How was I supposed to know that let it go meant not pull so hard, and that let her go up meant to pull harder? It's a breach of etiquette to stop ringing until the conductor gives the command. I could not say, I am lost. Let's start again. We tried again. After a while, the conductor said to me in his most polite Cockney, I hope you don't mind if I swear at you, miss, but I'm not used to ringing with a lady. But by that amount of time, no amount of swearing was going to deter me from learning how to ring. That was her first experience in the tower. There's another photo that I shared with Sarah that she's sitting with some gentlemen for her first handbell peal. On a Sunday afternoon, a while later, she's invited to someone's home, and they're going to try these same peals on handbells. And so here she says, I chose the easiest bells, 7 and 8. And for 2.5 hours, we scored a peer on Grandshire triplets. And that's one of the change ringing patterns with excellent striking. So after a break with hearty tea and ham and bread and butter, someone suggested we should try another peal. So for another 2.5 hours, they ring this particular peal. My father, who had sat silently, said, "Please don't suggest any more ringing tonight." He had reached his limit of enjoyment. But ringing 2 handbell peals in a day was considered a feat. And many of you will know the name Mr. Hughes, who was there, an owner of the bells on which we had performed. And this is again, quote from her memoirs. "Very generously, Mr. Hughes presented me with the bells." And these are the bells that she brought back to America, which started her Beacon Hill Ringers around the table history making for the United States and its development. So there's one other instance when she is in the Tower Bell. I'll go through this quickly, where she's saying, this is back in the Tower, "My good striking imparted an air of confidence to the men who no longer thought it necessary to watch me. But there were 2 apparently engrossed in my work. They lost his bell at an unchecked critical moment. The bell rolled over, rebounded against the stay, which is what you're stopping it on, and it was going wild, causing great confusing and dismay. And this peal was now within 3/4 of an hour of being completed. Great excitement ensued. There was shouting heard above the clashing of the bells. This was considered an emergency. But meanwhile, I kept a level head, maintained my count, and the correct sequence was resumed. I now became a recipient of congratulations on the part of the men for being of phlegmatic temperament, those who are usually quite reticent. So those were just a couple of stories I pulled from what she has written about her experience in England. But then coming back 6 weeks later, she also said she was really glad to get back to carpentry and tennis. So what happens next? Soon after, she gets married, and her husband is a woodworker himself. So therein is the connection. They're supporting each other from that perspective. They have 6 children. They begin teaching their children how to ring on these bells. And so here's another excerpt from this. By 1924, our children were able to ring. The youngest was 9. On Christmas Eve, we started caroling, standing in front of our home. The success surprised us. The crowd grew and applauded as loudly as they could through their muffled woolen gloves. We only knew about 6 tunes, so we rang them twice and went on to the next doorway. The crowd followed us. We tried to get the audience to sing with us, but this did not work well because their idea of time and hours were apt to be quite different. As we inched from one tune to another, occasionally someone would miss a bell. Any one of us would then point and glare at what should have been done. The bewildered look was always a source of amusement to those who were watching in the audience. Fortunately, we did not take ourselves too seriously. Doesn't that just kind of relate and bring some fun and bring some real humanness to this evolutionary process that she explored initially with her children before she actually adapts it to what became the Beacon Hill Ringers? So when does that happen? As the children are off to college, it was difficult to arrange satisfactory practice for this growing Christmas Eve ringing. So there was a president of a trust company who became very interested in what was going on. And he approached her and said, how can we form a band of ringers? And she told him. So this president of this corporation ordered the bells from Whitechapel, had costumes made with red and white little fluffy things. And by the following Christmas, there was huge publicity for this event that was going to happen with these bands on Christmas Eve. As you said, because of the advanced publicity, people turned up from all over the United States and even Canada. A rowdy element took possession of the streets in the late evening. The quiet atmosphere of peace and goodwill was transformed into riotous rollicking, which one finds itself after a football game. One year during World War II, with a blackout, we did not ring. Otherwise, in rain and snow and bitter cold, we have roamed the streets every Christmas Eve since this custom began with our children in 1924. All righty, from there I will go to, all right, I'm skipping ahead here, trying to catch up on some time. All righty, now we're at 1836. About this time, the church was really taking an active interest in ringing. The Sunday school department had now ordered their own set of bells just so that the boys could play, and they didn't need any advice from Margaret on how to do this. And there were so many bands now starting to ring in this area that, and you'll know this name as I read this, Mrs. Norman Erb, she was a subsequent president of the early guild, head of social activities, suggested that all of us get together. So the young people of the church, they served a simple supper before service. All the tables were filled, the tables were cleared away. We found ourselves in a large hall with a huge stage. The bands had developed these original lines of music and played almost faultlessly. It was the thrill of an evening for me. Then and there, in 1936, the New England Guild of Handbell Ringers was organized, and I was elected president. And those are her words in her memoir for this. So I couldn't help but share, just to help you get to know Margaret a little bit. And while I'm transitioning for just a moment, I included a picture that I've sometimes used for my students when I was able to teach my bells in worship class, of the heaviest bell in the world. Where is it? Well, the next time you happen to be in Kyoto, just kind of wander over to the temple, and here is the heaviest bell, 83 tons. It's only rung for ceremonial purposes and requires 16 people to get it going, back to using the stick, and certainly a place back to our roots. All right. So for Margaret Shirkla, oh my gosh, we're totally heading on time there. Okay. I need to jump very quickly then to a story that relates to the Swiss bell ringers and the state of North Carolina. And my apologies to those of you who are not from North Carolina, but this, I think, will certainly still be of interest to you. In 1840, the Swiss bell ringers, after they made their smashing grand opening in New York City, made their way down the East Coast. They found their way to Raleigh. They were doing their usual concert there, and there was a Superior Court judge by the name of William Gaston, who was that time working his term, and he stayed at this woman's home. He boarded with her when he was having to work in Raleigh. And Mrs. Taylor, who was the person at this home, saw that performance of the bell ringers and just fell in love with this one particular piece sung in a language that he could not understand. And I read somewhere that these bell ringers were told when they did sing just to use their best Cockney, and the Americans would think they were Swiss. All right, so she convinced the group of Swiss bell ringers the next morning to come around and play for the judge in front of his window. So they do, and passed music 200 melodic to write melody, and subsequently words to go along with this that became the text for the Old North State, which is the official song of the state of North Carolina. It was premiered at the convention in October of 1840 and eventually adopted as a North Carolina state song. So who knew that Swiss Handbell Ringers inspired the particular state? And I sent Sarah a link for curiosity, although you could also probably Google that yourself. I tried to find a really decent rendering of it, but it is there nonetheless. Okay, I'm just going to blaze through a couple of things here, hitting some highlights of what happens after Margaret and, oh, let's see, okay, let me skip ahead in the notes. All right, Doris Watson is a big next step in what happens next. She was at Brick Presbyterian Church, and she and her husband, I remember her telling me this story, that they were just wandering around through a festival one day, enjoying the afternoon, and they ran across some vaudeville type players and handbells that were still kind of keeping the art alive. And they had an aha moment. That aha moment was, you know, we need something to engage the youth of our church. Why don't we get some handbells and figure out how to use them in worship? And that was all it took. They ordered bells. She brought them into service, figured out, it gave the youth something to do. It gave them responsibility for being part of worship. And then she also squared up with Scott Perry, who's a name some of you might know because he put together one of these early books. And together with the two of them, they were really setting handbells on the map in the country. Doris Watson was the first to have her ringers featured on national CBS News during Christmas holiday. They made appearances with the New York Philharmonic. They were in the Macy's parade. I remember her showing me pictures of her ringers on the Macy's parade float. They were even appeared on the popular quiz show of Steve Allen, To Tell the Truth. And it was that quiz show that totally propelled the popularity of bells in New England. And they were just getting calls everywhere. We got to get bells in churches. We got to do this. We got to do this. The very first festival, I'm jumping ahead, 1954, 26 ringers attended. The dues were $2.50 at that particular time. Moving ahead again, Richard Litterst becomes the first now AGEHR music chairman. We now have progressed from the New England Guild to the American Guild of English Handbell Ringers. And in 1959, bells were featured at an MENC convention for the very first time in Chicago. Soon after, National President James Sawswadel developed the model, uniting people through musical art. And Jim and I are the only two past presidents from the same community of Winston-Salem, which was always fun. He always had a special interest in connecting with me when I was there. You all know the name Don Alyered. He had been in handbell ministry, he had been in church ministry 16 years before discovering handbells, but his was the first church choir to tour every 50 state of the United States with his church program and bells. Bob Ivy's ringers in 1965 took ringers to the New York World's Fair and the Radio City Music Hall with the Rockettes. His North Carolina choir was also the first one to tour in Germany. Pretty daring. And then late in the 70s, Katsumi Kodama from Japan really starts to come on the scene, bringing the influences of bells that had immigrated to his country now back into the United States. Okay, and I think we're a little bit top of the hour, so I'd better hush there, but that's a real fast bringing you into not quite where we are, but almost.
Well, we're so appreciative of both you and Bob's time tonight. I can't imagine how you condense, millions of moments into an hour or less, but you've done it with expert ease and given us some amazing highlights. I don't know if there are any questions before we end our session tonight, but I thought what was fun for me at least is to think about that great 90s song Video Killed the Radio Star, and you duly noted that the radio killed the bell ringing stars. So,
Yeah, pretty much.
however, not quite, because they didn't know we would outlast. But also that bells were really the internet of today, and I think that's so apropos because they really are. They hearken us all. Oh, that's a good point. You should have made this a two-parter. Well, maybe they'll be back. They have about 40 years to go, 40 or 50 years to go to bring us into the present. Well, thank you all for being on our call tonight. I do want to remind you that our next session is July 5th. And I wrote so many notes about what you were talking about. I can't find what it's about, but it's on July 5th. Let's see. Oh, the Schulmerich Foundry Tour is on July 5th. So please join us for that. And again, have a wonderful evening. And thank you both, Debbie and Bob, for your time tonight. And thank you all for being here.
Good to be with you. Thanks.
Thank you so much.